Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of our sponsors, including Aaron Ferguson Electric and Automation at aaronv.com, AARONV.com, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida. You're listening to episode 190 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Major Bill Ray and his career as a psychic spy. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
From the 1970s to the 1990s, the U.S. Defense Department conducted a psychic spying program that came to be known as Stargate. It was headquartered out of Fort Meade, Maryland, and relied on a psychic ability called remote viewing. One of the psychic spies who served at Fort Meade was Major Bill Ray. For a time, he also served as commander of the unit. So who is Major Ray? What role did he play in Stargate? And what can he tell us about remote viewing? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, what should we say to begin?
First, I'm very happy to be able to do this interview, and I want to say a special word of thanks to Paul Smith, who listeners will remember from episodes 156 and 157, where we interviewed him about his own career in Stargate. Paul very kindly put me in touch with Bill Ray, so I wanted to say thanks to him. Also, this will be a two-parter. In today's episode, we'll be talking with Major Ray about his career with the remote viewing project, as well as some about how remote viewing is thought to work. Then we'll arrive at a bit of a cliffhanger, where I start to ask him about the most terrifying remote viewing experience he ever had, which involved a massive simultaneous UFO abduction. So you'll want to listen again next week to find out all about that. But there's lots of good stuff we'll be covering this week.
What things should people be listening for in today's interview with Major Ray?
He mentions the names of a few men that you may want to be aware of. Early in the interview, he mentions a man named Skip Atwater. Atwater originally reported to Bill, but he went on to play a key role in founding the Stargate program, and he recruited Bill into it. Later, he mentions Major General James Dozier, who in 1981 was living in Verona, Italy, when he was kidnapped by the Italian Red Brigade, a communist terrorist group. The terrorists held General Dozier in Padua, Italy. In the interview, Bill pronounces Padua a couple of ways, but it's Padua, as in St. Anthony of Padua, that we're talking about. He also mentions Lieutenant General William Odom, who was a prominent critic of Stargate and opposed the program. So those are the names to listen for: Skip Atwater, James Dozier, and William Odom.
In the interview, you discuss a couple of methods of doing remote viewing known as CRV and ERV. What are these?
CRV is a method that was originally developed by Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff. If you want to hear about it, you can go back and listen to episodes 102 and 103. In CRV, you use a series of up to 6 structured stages to try to retrieve information about a target that you've been assigned to view. You're typically blind to the target, meaning you don't know what it is, but you're supposed to be able to psychically obtain impressions of the target, what it looks like, and so forth. Originally, the initials CRV stood for coordinate remote viewing because you were given the geographical coordinates, the longitude and latitude of the target. But today, the initials stand for controlled remote viewing. And as we'll hear, Major Ray played a key role in jettisoning the geographical coordinates from the technique.
And what about ERV?
ERV stands for extended remote viewing. In an ERV exercise, you lie down, relax, and try to get to the point where you're almost asleep, but not quite. While in this relaxed state, you try to acquire psychic impressions of the target. ERV is more of a free-form method and doesn't use the same series of 6 controlled stages that CRV does. Major Ray was trained by Ingo Swann in CRV, but after he started working at Fort Meade, he began doing ERV as well. So those are some of the basic things people should be listening for.
Not all of our listeners may be familiar with remote viewing. Where should they go for more information?
We've discussed remote viewing a number of times on the program, but one of the best places to go is back to episodes 102 and 103, where we covered the basics. In those episodes, we looked at the scientific evidence concerning remote viewing, so you can make up your own mind of whether you find it credible. We also covered it from the faith perspective. And for more on the faith perspective, you may wish to check out episodes 105 and 106 on St. Thomas Aquinas and the occult, where we discussed the fact that even saints and doctors of the church, like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, believed that God built weak natural abilities into human nature that we would today classify as psychic abilities. So listen to 105 and 106 for a detailed look at the faith perspective on psychic and other unusual phenomena.
Before we get to the interview with Major Ray, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Fonseca B., Mary C., Jeffrey M., Richard H., and Michael F. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Catechism Class, a dynamic weekly podcast journey through the Catechism of the Catholic Church by Greg and Jennifer Willits. It's the best book club, coffee talk, and faith study group all rolled into one. Find it in any podcast directory. And without further ado, here's part one of our interview with Major Bill Ray.
Bill Ray is a veteran of 5 wartime tours in Iraq, Kuwait, and Afghanistan. He is a retired Army major and Department of Defense civilian with more than 50 years of combined federal government service as an intelligence and counterintelligence officer. He is one of 5 Stargate military remote viewers trained by Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, the developers of remote viewing. After Joe McMonagle's departure, Bill became the primary remote viewer using extended remote viewing, or ERV, at the Fort Meade unit, while continuing to work operational and training targets using controlled remote viewing, or CRV. From 1985 to 1987, he served as the commander of the Fort Meade Psychic Spying Unit. He has a bachelor's degree in history from the State University of New York and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Southern California. He currently resides in Wisconsin. Welcome to the program, Major Ray.
Thank you, Jimmy. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you also for your service to our country.
You're welcome. It's a privilege to serve.
Can you tell us about your background, what it was like growing up, your family, what you were doing before your RV career, things like that?
Okay. I'm the oldest of 7 children. I was born in Santa Monica, California, before the war, World War II. I had 2 brothers, 4 sisters. I'm 8 years older than the next oldest one because of the war. Dad went away, and Mom had several problems after that. I attended Catholic school, raised by the nuns for the first 8 years, and through high school, I was taught by the Brothers of St. Patrick. All of them were from the old sod. After graduation, I went in the military, ended up in the infantry, airborne paratrooper, volunteered and got accepted into Ranger School, graduated from that. When my time of service was up, I got out of the Army. I still had reserve time to do a little obligation. Went to work at a grocery wholesaler, started unloading boxcars, then moved into the office, met my wife, Sandy Glenn, in a We got married. I missed the Army, went back into the Army, ended up in the MPs briefly, volunteered for military intelligence, got accepted. They sent me to German language school, ended up in Germany, came back, went to officer candidate school. At the time, I was a staff sergeant. Going through OCS, officer candidate school, I was almost 33. Next oldest person in the class was 26. Halfway through the course, they dropped the age limit to 26 to be commissioned. So I was grandfathered in, but if anything happened, it couldn't be recycled. So as a result, I became literally the oldest lieutenant, captain, and major in the Army for a while. After OCS, I went back to Fort Huachuca, taught at the school, where one of the people working for me was Skip Atwater. He was a staff sergeant at the time. And another person was Rob Hartley. And they were my two NCOs. I talked them both into going to officer candidate school. I sent Skip Atwater to OCS. He went away to Fort Benning, came back to Fort Huachuca. They were required to go through the basic officer course. So Skip went through. I instructed him in a couple of courses. When he was getting ready, he came down on orders for Fort Meade as an OPSEC officer, which is a very boring job for a counterintelligence officer. So Skip and I went out, had one last beer together. I thought I would never see him again. I was a German linguist. Skip was a Spanish linguist. So our careers probably weren't going to cross over later. Skip went to Fort Meade, and that's how the project eventually got started. He was doing operational security of units, addressing their problems, how they could be more secure. And one of the commanders there, I believe it was a colonel, asked him, he'd seen a program on Soviet remote viewing and wanted to know how he could protect himself against that. Skip brought her back, went up and asked the commanding general of the Intelligence and Security Command, who told him to research it. He did. Figured out kind of how to do it. Started off, actually, the project at Fort Meade started off as a defensive project. People don't know. It rapidly morphed into a collection activity.
And you joined the Fort Meade program in 1984. How did that happen? Did you get a call from Skip? Or I'm pretty sure they don't have Uncle Sam wants you to be a psychic spy poster.
Unfortunately not. No. Strange enough, I went to Germany after teaching at the intelligence course. Skip was out at Fort Meade. I went to Germany, spent a year in Munich. They had a command slot open up in Augsburg for the counterintelligence field office for Western Bavaria. I put him forward and was chosen. I spent 3 years up there, and then I went back to the captain's course. So I was going at a very late date to the captain's course. Skip ended up going to the same course, and we ended up, because we both had a lot of kids, living across the street from each other. So we got back in contact. Obviously, the project at the time was a special access program, abbreviated to SAP. So he couldn't tell me about it. But after we both graduated from the course, I stayed at Huachuca, became the intelligence officer for a Cigna brigade for about 18 months. My only non-counterintelligence, really non-civilian closed assignment, except for combat assignments. And Skip came out, talked to me one day from Fort Meade, and read me onto the program. I talked to my wife. Look, I couldn't tell Sandy what it was about, but she agreed, and we ended up at Fort Meade in January 3rd, 1984.
After you joined the program, you were then trained in remote viewing, or specifically in what was then called coordinate remote viewing, later controlled remote viewing.
Yes.
You were trained by Ingo Swan. What was Ingo like, and what was the training like? What was he like as a teacher?
Ingo was actually a fantastic individual. Our training varied. We would spend a couple of weeks out at San Francisco, Palo Alto, Stanford Research Institute. And then back at Fort Meade, we would spend every other week up at New York being trained by Ingo, and the following week down at Fort Meade, and then back and forth. So we did that. There were 4 of us in my group, and then there was Tom McNair, who would be going the odd week. He started before we did. He started with Rob Hartley, who would also work with me with Skip. And I also sent to OCS. I actually got rid of all my best instructors working for me. But unfortunately, Rob came down with cancer and ultimately passed away. So Tom was on his own, and the 4 of us, Charlene Schufelt, myself, Paul Smith, and Ed Dames, were the traveling team going back and forth.
Now, from the reading I've done and also some personal knowledge, the 4 of you Ingo himself seems to have been a kind of colorful character.
Yes, very.
He could be a little abrupt. He
Yes.
had a lot of interesting ideas. And any time a person reads about Ingo, they'll encounter that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
In reading about your training group, the 4 of you,
Yes.
Bill Ray, Ed Dames, Paul Smith, and Charlene Schufelt, then Charlene Kavanaugh,
Yes.
at least 3 of you seem to be a little colorful yourselves. Now, Charlene, I've never heard anybody say she seems the most even-keeled in some ways.
In some ways she was, yes. She was kind of an odd man out in some ways. Yeah. You mentioned Ingo was terrifying.
Well, tell me about Ingo first then.
I dearly loved Ingo, but Ingo was very scary when he was down sitting at the other end of the table, and when something just wouldn't come, it was very. He'd be frustrated, I'd be frustrated, and it just kind of went from there. But I learned early on to volunteer to be the first person to go in. And I would go in and get it out of the way. I did well partly because of Ed and Paul, mainly Ed Dames, because Ed was always getting Ingo mad. So that got him off my back. And when Ed didn't, Paul seemed to have a tendency to rile Ingo too, not as bad as Ed did. But that was very interesting. Actually, Ed Dames is probably the most left-brained person you will ever meet.
And that's an issue in remote viewing, because the idea is you want to diminish what your analytical left brain functions are in order to let the intuitive right brain information come through from the target.
Yes, perfectly. And Ed had to have closure every day. And I'm not exaggerating when I say when I came into work in the morning, when Ed came in, and he'd need to go outside and we'd talk, and he would literally tell me the meaning of life. And then we'd go in, and the next day it would happen again. He had got some more information the previous day, so he would tell me the meaning of life. And it became pretty much a rite of passage that every morning Ed would tell me the meaning of life, because he had gotten some more information the day before. So he had to have closure on that.
So his understanding of the meaning of life kept changing from day to day.
Yes. Yeah. A little each time. Now, I would think the first 3 weeks of training with Ingo, we didn't do remote viewing. Ingo basically gave us a history of psychic research going back to the 14th, 15th century, even farther, and providing, if not a scientific, at least a pseudoscientific background for remote viewing, which I think Ed had to have with his left brain. Paul, that's kind of a scientific bent at times too, though he's very right brain. So he needed that. Charlene could care less. I'm Irish. If you told me it's magic, then, we could have saved 3 weeks.
So among the four of you, at least two, Ed Dames and Paul Smith, have written books, and they both have characterizations of what you were like when they first met you. Mm-hmm. In Ed Dames's book, Tell Me What You See, he says this. He says, Ray, meaning you,
yes,
was also a Californian like me, a smooth counterintelligence man straight out of Central Casting, with his mustache and dark hair splashed with just the right amount of gray around the temples, a devoted pipe smoker with an equal devotion to beer and bad music. He insisted the 100-mile drive from Fort Meade to the Monroe Institute would be no problem for him, despite an agonizing back problem he had suffered years earlier in a parachute jump mishap. He was just happy to be there, he said. So was I, Ed says. So he gives a little bit of flavor for you there. Then Paul, in his book, Reading the Enemy's Mind, says, Bill Ray showed up at Fred, that's Skip Atwater's driveway the first week in January, unfolding his lanky frame from the front seat of a black Subaru station wagon out of the tailgate and every other door of the small car. Kids erupted. The Rays were a large, happy family. So he mentions, I've heard Paul on other occasions mention he doesn't know how you got that many kids in the car. How many was it at the time, by the way?
I think it was 5 at that time.
Okay. Then a little bit later on, Paul writes that in 1987, some old hands were preparing to leave. One of the first to go at the end of June was Bill Ray with orders for Europe in hand. We were going to miss Bill's fedora hat and omnipresent pipe, his optimistic outlook and jovial good sense. One thing we wouldn't miss, though, was his tendency to burst into off-key Irish songs at every opportunity. So they've both given some good-natured color descriptions there. I want to give you a chance to do the same for them if you'd like.
Well, obviously they are both musicators. Have very little taste when it comes to good music. With Ed, I never did go to the Monroe Institute. They went in '83.
That may have been my mistake. I may have had the.
No, that was Ed. Ed's book. He somehow remembers me going to the Monroe Institute, but I traveled down there while I was at Fort Meade and ran things down, but I never attended the Monroe Institute. And when I went there, I always flew down. So, Ed's a character. Ed and I, Ed was the only one who I'd go out and have an Irish whiskey with. Paul, being Mormon, doesn't drink. He'd be a much better drinking companion, I think, than Ed. But, at the time, I was still drinking. I quit drinking 30 years ago. Hasn't affected my voice. It's still beautiful. But Ed, once again, needing closure, has got himself into some hot water with recent predictions and those kind of things, which haven't panned out. We never used Ed as a viewer, probably because of his propensity to be so left-brained. At least when I was there, when I commanded the unit, we did. Ed was a monitor and an analyst. Now, on the unit, the monitors and the analysts, and they were basically Ed Dames and Gene Lessman when I was there.
The way that would work for listeners who may not know is you'd have a remote viewer attempting to be assigned a target. He wouldn't know what it was, typically, and he would be trying to receive impressions of what's at the target site. And as he's engaged in that process, he would have another person sitting with him, known as a monitor, whose job was to prompt him and take notes and things like that.
Precisely, yes. And if several viewers were working the same target, then the monitor also was the analyst. He had been with the viewers. Maybe Gene and Ed both were involved in the same project. But in the end, it was the monitor's job, as an analyst, to put together a report for the customer. So we'd be going home at 1630, 1700, and they'd be still there burning the night oil, putting reports together, analyzing what we had said. So the viewers got the glory, but the true heroes, the interior linemen of the unit were the analyst monitors.
And Ed Dames functioned principally as a monitor. In later years, they used him a little bit as a viewer, but he was mainly a monitor. He's gotten, as you alluded to, a kind of reputation for making doomsday predictions, not all of which have happened, since we haven't had that many doomsdays.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Tell me about Paul Smith. He is a kind of interesting guy, too. Now, you mentioned he's Mormon. One of the things I know he's famous for is his particular cool-down method, where he would be getting ready to remote view.
Yes. When Paul cooled down, it was the opposite of cooling down. He would go over to the operational building, put headphones on, and play some very loud, terrible rock music, hard rock. And that got him in the mood to go in and remote view. Once again, I've always questioned Paul's taste in music.
It does seem a bit unusual, a guy who's this somewhat mild-mannered Mormon listening to heavy metal, although he also says he would listen to country and some other things, too. But he has presented it as, I was psyching myself up to do this.
Yes, I can understand that. There seems to be, and no matter how many times you remote viewed, if you have a string going of 20 hits in a row, or a dozen hits in a row, or 3 hits in a row, there is that feeling that this is really impossible. How can I do this? And I think almost, I hate to speak for all viewers have a fear of failure. When you go in, I boxed in my youth, and it was like, what if I go in and get knocked out in 15 seconds? And I suspect it's what an actor feels when he goes on stage. What if I forget my lines? And it's boxing, once you get it the first time, it goes away. Remote viewing, once you get the feeling you're on target, it goes away. And I can't speak to actors.
Now, you had been trained in coordinate remote viewing, or CRV, but there was another methodology that was also being used at the Fort Meade unit known as extended remote viewing, or ERV.
Yes.
And the gentleman who, prior to you, had kind of specialized in this was named Joseph McMonigal, but he ended up transferring out of the unit in September of 1984, and the group didn't have someone who was specializing in ERV, so you decided to. What is ERV, and how were you trained in it?
Extended remote viewing is a CRV. You don't go into an altered state. You basically sit down with a pen in your hand and start recording and start writing or jotting down the site as it comes to you in varying steps and stages. Extended remote viewing, you achieve a altered state. Somebody could probably define that altered state, beta, delta, gamma, whatever. But you do achieve an altered state. You
basically relax and
yes,
then let the psychic impressions come to you.
Yes.
So you're like be laying on a bed or a couch or something, and you relax deeply. It's sometimes been described as a mind awake, body asleep state, where you're kind of on the fringe of falling asleep, but the goal is not to.
I equate it to skin diving, scuba diving. You have a threshold below and a threshold above. If you come up too close back to consciousness, you lose the sight. And then you may be able to regain it, you may not. If you go too deep, I don't know where you go. Some people say you're falling asleep. That's all it is. I think you go someplace when you come back, you don't recall. But it's the thing with extended remote viewing. You have to have a monitor. It's very good to tape the session. When I got to the project, there's about 12 people, but 2 of them were secretaries. We had 2 secretaries because you had to transcribe Joe's session. And when you're in the altered state, it's kind of like talking with a mouthful of mush and marbles. And so it's and you would have to go through the tapes over and over again to get what he did, because if you're trying to recall things, you may not pick up all the details.
And so that's part of why it's especially important with ERV to have a monitor, because it keeps the viewer from falling asleep or going off track, to have someone there interviewing him and posing the questions to him, which then get recorded or otherwise taken down, since he's not writing them himself.
The viewer really is pretty much brainless. There's only one brain in the room. It should be the monitor. And you might say, okay, I'm here now. There's 3 buildings, and the monitor may say, which building's important? Well, I don't really know. So the monitor will then decide, okay, go into first building on your right. And the viewer does that. And you really aren't making good decisions. You may have a feeling this is important, but you need somebody with a brain outside to guide you.
Now, much of the time with controlled remote viewing or coordinate remote viewing, viewers will describe the impressions they're getting as being rather faint, kind of like a half-forgotten memory of, oh yeah, I think that's what this site is like. It sounds like ERV is a much more immersive experience, where you have a much greater perception of the site, like being there. Is that accurate? For me, that is correct. To me, and this is just Bill as remote viewing, CRV seems to me you're pulling information from the site. You're pulling the information in. ERV is you're going to the site and getting the information. I find ERV more exciting, and I'm kind of a adrenaline junkie, so I'd like it better. As a paratrooper, that's a good thing.
Yes.
So it's kind of like an out-of-body experience, or similar to that.
Yeah, it's similar to that, but
you're still feeling like you're in your body and able to talk.
Yes. Now, Joe McMonagle also has done a lot of OBEs, out-of-body experiences. But the thing is that you don't report back on OBEs. You can't be directed to go to a certain building or a certain area, or tell me more about that. And when you come back, you may not recall everything that happened on the OBE.
Now, you had been trained in CRV by Ingo and Hal.
Yes.
How were you trained in ERV?
Well, interesting, I wasn't. After Joe had left, I approached Skip on a Friday and said, we really could use another ERV, or would give us more options. We'd have more resources, and I'd like to learn ERV. And Skip said, okay, Bill, let's start Monday. And I said, grand. So I came in Monday, pen and paper in hand, expecting to be trained. And we went over from the admin area across the little walk over to the operational building, and I went in and did ERB. And there was no training. Now, I had watched Joe remote view, and Joe was hooked up to skin galvanizers and other things. And so when Joe was on, I knew what his body was doing. The polarity was reversed and other things. And I was there one time, and I was talking to Skip in the control room, and Joe was babbling on in a viewing room. And I said, shouldn't we be listening? And he said, no, look here. I said, he's been off target for 10 minutes. He just doesn't know it yet. So I had learned how to make my body like Joe's body when he was viewing. So when I went in and I wasn't going to get any instruction, I did that. And after a while, I found the signal line. And the signal line in ERB is the same signal line in CRB. It feels the same. And that's kind of hard to explain. It feels stronger in ERB, I think, because you're in an altered state. Mm-hmm. I picked it up.
We should explain for listeners, the signal line is a way of conceptualizing the flow of information coming to a viewer from the site. And so if you are having an accurate flow of information, you're said to have found the signal line or to be on signal. Yes.
And in CRB, the longer you do a session, the deeper you Step one, stage one is very vague, and stage one is the hardest one. Once you do that, everything else is going to come, but you have to get that one down. And as you get in 2, 3, 4, it feels much stronger. You know you're there. You know you're on target. Mm-hmm. You're on we call it riding the signal line. It's a metaphor, but it fairly accurately describes the feeling you have when you're on target.
Now, we mentioned the cool down process where viewers getting ready to begin viewing, and we mentioned Paul Smith's preferred technique, at least at the time, was to listen to music that he found invigorating. I know another of your colleagues, Tom McNear, who's a Protestant Christian, has a prayer that he would say as his cool down. You had these two methodologies of CRV and ERV. What did you use as cool down?
In CRV, I would do a fairly fast Hail Mary, concentrating on that Blessed Virgin, of course. Wouldn't want to get into the altered state. On ERB, I didn't call it at the time, but thinking back to it now, I meditated on the Hail Marys, 3 of them very deeply. And that seemed to get me into the altered state.
So you were putting...
That wouldn't work for CRB because I'd be too far down.
So you were putting your viewing sort of under Mary's mantle.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the things that often happens in ERV is before a viewer will go to the target, as they're cooling down, they will go to a place in their mind that's sometimes called their sanctuary location. And then once they're in their sanctuary location, they'll be given the target and they'll proceed there.
Yes.
What was your sanctuary location?
Okay, sanctuary was a concept that Gene Lessman, also an Irishman born in Belfast, came up with. My sanctuary, I didn't know. The idea was to keep it a secret, or I'm not quite sure why. I think it was more psychological. I eventually figured out where it was. I had picked this place out of, it was a hillside, a little grotto, a lake behind it, a lot of rain, and I eventually was able to just go back up slowly. And I believe my sanctuary was in County Roscommon in Ireland.
So you had a location that wasn't just an imaginary field or something, but something that was an actual site on Earth that you were then able to identify.
I went there and I felt comfortable. I still go there when I go to the dentist.
I imagine a lot of people would like to have a sanctuary location they could go to when they're at the dentist.
Anybody can do it. Just send your psychic out to find a spot you feel very comfortable in, and then recall it when they start to drill.
Yeah. One thing that ERVers are reported to be able to do frequently is interact with people who are at the target site. So they'll be viewing the site, they'll see somebody there, and they'll be able to go up to that person and ask them a question and get an answer. And presumably, since they're not physically there, this would be like some kind of telepathy with the other person's subconscious, perhaps, or a way of giving yourself permission to receive certain information or something like that. Have you had experiences like that?
Quite frequently. It was one of the advantages of ERV. I think it's possible in CRB. We just haven't figured it out yet. You do it to some extent in stage 4, but it's more or less grasping the emotional state of all the people at the site. But at the site, they had me working. You're not supposed to know where you're going because of imagination and all that. So it's usually at least single blind, the viewer, and quite frequently the monitor has no idea where you're going either. But I eventually figured they were sending me to the Kremlin once a month or twice a month to monitor, see what was going on. It was
it's really easy to recognize the Kremlin.
Right. All you do is, this is the Kremlin. I didn't let them know I knew. And I met, there was a 3-star general there named Yuri, who was a grandfather I quite liked, and I would kind of sit in with him in the meetings. But I went there one time. I think Gene Lessman was the monitor, and I got there, and I got to the building, no problem. I couldn't find the room, and I had never had that problem before, and I probably was overthinking it. But now I'm psychically going through the halls of the Kremlin trying to find this room, and I can't. And Gene finally says, "Bill," says, "ask somebody." I said, okay. So I went down. There was a kiosk there, and they were serving tea and pastries. So I went up, and there was one guy sitting there. And I said, "Look, I need to get to this room." He said, "Can you tell me where it is?" And he says, "Not allowed. You can't go there." I said, "No, it's okay." And so I'm arguing with him that he can tell me where it is, and he's telling me it's not allowed. You can't go there. Don't. So I leave him, and there's another guy standing there, and I say, "I need to find this room." He said, "Oh, I'll take you." Right over here. So 2 different people, 2 different psychics. And one was, no way was he going to violate security. And the other, "Yeah, I'll help you out." But, and a lot of times, I'll give you an example of Joe McMonagle. One of the sites he did when General Dozier was captured. They were trying to figure out where General Dozier was being held.
General Dozier was an American general who was in Italy and was kidnapped for a while by terrorists, and he eventually was recovered.
Right. He was actually not through remote viewing, but we could have. But so he was a brigadier general. He was in Verona and had been kidnapped by the Rota Brigata, the Brigade Brigata, Italian terrorist group. And this was before my time, but I read the reports. And actually, DIA got some civilian remote viewers, flew into Italy, and was trying to help him find him, was running all around. At the time, the civilian remote viewers were very overrated, I think. But Joe was back at Fort Meade, and he came up with find the place. So Joe went and actually found where Dozier was. But the problem is, where is he? Well, he's here, but where are you? So Joe had to figure out a way to find out where he was. So he finally came up with Padua, which is where actually the correct answer. But asked Joe one time, "How'd you come up? How'd you find that out?" And he said, "Well, I went back 300 years found a church bishop and asked him who he was, and he would said, "I'm the Archbishop of Padua." So not only did he go back 300 years, then he made contact with somebody who told him who he was, which creates a lot of interesting ideas about the time and how it works.
Mm-hmm. In late 1984, the Fort Meade program, which at the time was called Center Lane, was closed. And it began the process of transferring over to the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Yes.
During this time, you were the second in command at the Fort Meade unit, and you had a meeting with the Army Undersecretary James Ambrose and Lieutenant General William Odom, who was a prominent critic of the program. He was not a fan. Can you tell us about that meeting?
Yes, I think this was probably 85. Colonel Brian Busby had been the commander, but had, through no fault of his own, had some difficulties with DIA, basically because of political issues between DIA and the Army intelligence. So Brian was not going to go with the project when he left the Army. So I was taking over. I was almost a major. I think I was captain promotable, probably a few weeks from being a major. But went down to the Pentagon. And what we had is a red book, which has since disappeared. Nobody can find it. But the red book at that time listed every session, every project that we've been tasked with, and the results of that project. And then we had some examples of things we had done, and we would brief that, and we had like a briefing chart. Anybody that we briefed it to, we convinced, with the exception of General Odom. Odom wouldn't listen to it. So I went down with this General Odom. I was carrying this red book with me that I was going to brief. And I went in, he said to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning. So I got to the Pentagon, went in, suit and tie, and there's the secretary, and she sends me to see General Odom. He says, appointments for 3 o'clock, 1,500 hours. Be back here at 5 minutes before. Yes, sir. So away I go. And I'm at the Pentagon all day, walking around, carrying this secret briefing with me. And I show up about 14:30. There's no way I'm going to go 5 minutes before the meeting set. So I'm sitting there, and it's now 15:10, and we haven't left yet for Ambrose's office. So we're going to go down and brief. And finally, Odom comes out and has the secretary call Ambrose's secretary, because Ambrose was still in the meeting. So in the Pentagon, it's who waits on who has the power. So when Ambrose is free, then... So eventually about 15:30, his secretary called. So General Odom and I walked down the hallway, and I'm thinking, General Odom is the number one intelligence general in the Army, and normally you support your commander. But I wasn't in his command, and I already had 20 years in, I could retire. So I figured, well, no, do I support him or am I honest? And I decided to be honest. So we go in, and Ambrose is still in this meeting, so we sit down and wait for 10 minutes. General Odom's going crazy. So we go in, and we start the briefing, and I'm showing him things. And one of the things is the project had the highest success rate of any collection platform the military had, or the civilians had at the time.
Intelligence collection.
Yes, intelligence collection. We were at 50% of projects we worked on were rated by the customer as of exceptionally high value. And that's if you get 10% being of some value, you're doing okay if you're a collection. But anyhow, so we went in, and I sat down, and we got there, and I briefed Odom. Odom was there, and he did his spiel about that the Army is not the place for it and all that. So I showed him, the first one I showed him was one of the things Joe McMoneagle had worked on was the Typhoon Submarine, which was a fantastic success for Joe.
This was
And
Typhoon Submarine was a Russian submarine that was really quiet, that was being developed in secrecy
Yes.
by the Russians. And one of Joe McMoneagle's tasks was to describe it, and he was able to do that
Yes.
despite the fact it was in a sealed building in Russia.
Yep. We were tasked, and the CIA came back and said that we missed the target because Joe said it was this huge submarine, and they weren't sure it was a submarine. It had this huge tail, which no submarine ever had, and it had a bunch of missile tubes, and they were cantered at an angle. And missile tubes on a submarine are all straight up and down to fire, Tomahawk missiles or whatever. So they said we missed it. And plus, it wasn't right on the water. Then 6 months later, they started drilling a trench, and the Typhoon came out, and we were right on. So I briefed that, and the general said, well, let me explain. Said, we could verify that 6 months later, so we didn't really need them. I said, well, intelligence is to get as many sources as you can. So I gave him something else that we were the sole source. We're the only one reported on. Or says, well, we don't know if that's correct because they're the sole source. So I sarcastically said, well, if we're one of many reporting, then that's not good. And if we're the only one reporting, that's not good. So they said, yeah. I said, okay. So I had a bunch of letters from people who were supporting the project. One at the time, Bill Gates was the acting director of CIA. William O. Casey had died, who we briefed earlier. But I had from general officers, general officer level civilians. I gave all these letters to Ambrose, which Odom didn't know I had.
These were supportive letters testifying to the value of what the program was doing.
Yes, that this is worth keeping. So Odom says, well, sir, I can explain that. And I was wondering how he was going to do that. And it was that the people want to maintain access to this technology. So they're willing to say anything to do that. So if they're willing to do anything to maintain access to technology, it must be worth something. If you're saying they're willing to lie to keep it. That didn't go over well, and I left, and we got kicked out of the Army and had to pick another agency, which DIA was not a certainty. The CIA had wanted us, NSA had wanted us, and the medical R&D community had wanted us. And I eventually settled on DIA, which is good because had we gone over to NSA, Odom came over 6 months later and became the director of NSA. I was worried the Medical Research Command, they'd be shoving tubes down our throat and any place else they could put tubes to see why we work. CIA would have been probably preferable at the time, but they had just mined the harbors of Nicaragua, and they couldn't take any more controversy, they thought. So we ended up over at DIA. Jack Verliner from DIA was always a big supporter of ours, so that worked out well.
Now, as we mentioned originally, CRV stood for Coordinate Remote Viewing.
Yes.
And what would happen is the tasker would give a viewer a set of geographical coordinates, such and such latitude and longitude, and then the viewer would go there. But that's not typically done anymore. And these days, CRV stands for Controlled Remote Viewing, because it's done in a series of stages where you get different types of information about the site.
Correct.
The shift, or an important moment in the shift between coordinate and controlled remote viewing, occurred in April of 1985, and you played a role in changing that. Tell me what happened. Why did it stop being coordinate remote viewing?
Well, what we did, we went from coordinates, and then we figured, well, the problem with coordinates, if you tell me this is 6 degrees north, my mind's going to say it's going to be cold here, or if it's on the equator, it's going to be warm. So you're starting to put the left brain into action. So what we did was we had a random number generator. And so we would take the coordinates put it into the random number generator, which would check out a random number.
So
and we would use that number.
This was encrypted coordinates at the time.
It'd be an encrypted coordinate. Yeah.
Yeah.
One day we were going and working, and there were several things going on. I was going back and forth. I just got back from being down at CIA headquarters and got back and came in, and I think it was Ed came running in and he was going to do a target. I said, Bill, I need the coordinates for this target. And so I sat down and wrote down a series of numbers and gave them to him. Just and it worked.
So it went from actual geographic coordinates to then an encrypted form, so they weren't recognizable.
Right.
And then one day you were just too busy and just wrote down random stuff and said, use
Try
that,
this.
and it worked.
Yeah, just leave me alone. Go do this. And I think it's the intent of the viewer to fulfill the the tasking, and that's what we all use now. It's pretty much you can come up with something specific to the target, specific to the date, and we haven't had a problem.
So it continues to work just based on the intention of the tasker, even though the coordinates are just random letters and numbers at this point.
Yeah, which we assign to a manila folder, and we put the target inside the manila folder. So we've established a link of some sort. But it's
now another thing.
Going to cue anybody.
Another thing that happened in April of 1985, specifically on April 7th, was you had a very powerful viewing session.
Yes.
What can you tell me about that and what happened?
And that will serve as our cliffhanger for this episode. Jimmy, what will Major Ray be telling us about when we pick up next time?
He'll be telling us about one of the most dramatic remote viewing experiences he ever had. The target was a mass UFO abduction in the Gulf of San Matias, Argentina. And as we'll hear, the fear that Major Ray experienced in the viewing was so great that he still feels visceral fear when he thinks about the event today. But he's going to read us his original remote viewing results of the experience. We'll also be hearing about his experiences remote viewing Roswell and the Ark of the Covenant. And we'll be discussing his Catholic faith and how he understands it in relationship to remote viewing.
Excellent. So, Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listener and viewer?
We'll have Paul Smith's book, Reading the Enemy's Mind, which is a history of the Stargate program. Also, Ed Dames's book, Tell Me What You See. We'll have an article that appeared about Bill Ray's retirement with video where he came back to where he lives from Afghanistan. Also, information on controlled remote viewing by Paul Smith, and also extended remote viewing by Paul Smith, as well as an image of the Kremlin so you can see how visually distinctive it is, and information about General James Dozier, who was kidnapped, Lieutenant General William Odom, who opposed the Stargate program, and the Typhoon-class submarine.
Excellent. All right. So, Jimmy, what do we have for mysterious headlines this week?
Well, since we're talking about remote viewing, which is sometimes classified as an additional sense that humans might have, we have a theme for mysterious headlines of the world as viewed through other senses. And just recently, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was awarded to some scientists for discovering the mechanism that is used in two rather obvious senses, but at least one of them is not often recognized. The two senses are temperature and touch. And we've known for some time that these senses are mediated by nerves in our skin, but they actually found the relevant kinds of nerves, and yes, they are different. So temperature is really a different sense than touch, than pressure. And so, and we have different kinds of nerves that do that, that perform those functions. So that's something interesting to check out, but also very interesting. We'll have links to two videos. One about the world as we would see it if we could see into the infrared part of the spectrum, and also a second video on the world as we would see it if we could perceive it in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. So those are the two areas that are closest on the electromagnetic spectrum to visible light. Red has the lowest frequency of visible light, so infrared is less in frequency than visible red, and then at the other end of the spectrum, violet has the highest frequency of visible light, and so ultraviolet is just beyond the violet in terms of its an even higher frequency. And it turns out, even though humans don't really see infrared and ultraviolet, other creatures do, and that has an impact on how the world looks. And these are really fascinating videos. I watch both of them myself. It's really interesting stuff, including one of the subjects that gets discussed is what plants would might look like on alien planets, depending on the type of sun they have. Because obviously the plants here on Earth have evolved to receive energy from our sun, and there's a reason that most plants are green as opposed to some other color. But it would be different on other planets. So check out these two videos. They're really fascinating on the world in infrared and the world in ultraviolet. They're both on YouTube. And by the way, while you're on YouTube, be sure and stop by my channel and remember to like, comment, and especially subscribe. I'm trying to grow my channel. We're getting near 25,000 subscriptions. So please do subscribe and hit the bell notifications. We're also now doing videos, posting the videos of the podcast on other platforms like Rumble and BitChute and Odyssey. We're doing an experiment with that. So if you'd like to see us there, also if those are the platforms you prefer, be sure and stop by and also subscribe there.
Very good. Excellent. So that's it from us. What are your theories about remote viewing and what Major Ray has told us about his career? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to mysterious@sqpn.com, sending a tweet to @mys_world, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 618-738-4515. That's 618-738-4515. Jimmy, what are we going to be talking about next time?
Next week, Major Ray will be telling us about some of his most dramatic remote viewing experiences, including that massive simultaneous alien abduction, Roswell, and the Ark of the Covenant.
Excellent. I want to remind you all to like this episode on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious Worlds page on Facebook and retweet it on Twitter and share it wherever you can to help us grow our audience. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion and links to the mysterious headlines on our show notes at sqpn.com/mysterious. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Fearvento Law, PLLC, specializing in adult guardianships and conservatorships, probate and estate planning matters, accepting clients throughout Michigan, taking into account your individual healthcare, financial, and religious needs. Visit fearventolaw.com, FIORVENTO law.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.